All right, so we're going to be talking about blood flow restriction training and bone density, and I'm really excited about this topic. It's coming up more and more just in the world. I mean, as most of you probably know, bone density tends to be a challenge for women as they go through midlife and beyond. They're getting osteopenia and osteoporosis is becoming more common, and I've been hearing even younger women because of how much we're sitting in our society, in our culture now. Bone density is even becoming an issue at a younger age because really, ideally for bone density, you want to do a lot of activity as a younger adolescent, whether it's sports or jumping, running, lifting, to develop great bone density from a young age. And that's just not happening for all, for everyone as they're growing up these days with our culture. So bone density is definitely becoming a thing. Hold on, let me let this person in. There we go. And it's long been understood that for good bone density, the two best ways to increase bone density is through kind of impact training, like jumping, running, anything with an impact, because that sudden contraction of a muscle pulls on the bone and stimulates bone growth. It stimulates cellular turnover of your bone. The other way is heavy loading. So, heavy carries, heavy deadlifts, heavy squats, things that's either loading your spine with weight, like a carry is loading your spine or loading your hips. The problem as we age, we've talked about this before, is there's a lot of people, myself included, because I had a hip replacement, that it's difficult to do high load or high impact training. Or even if you can, it's like if you do it 3 times a week, there's a lot of stress on the body. There's more downtime. There's more recovery time that's needed. And so my question is, what place does blood flow restriction training have in improving bone density for people, especially women, but for anyone? And what do we know so far in the research? So what we're going to dive into today, and I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen, um, is kind of what the existing research is with um, with BFR and bone density. And there's not a ton. There's been a lot out there, but there's a lot of variation in protocols, and so it makes it very hard to summarize. But that's what I've done, is looked at a meta-analysis of BFR and bone density, and we're going to kind of go through that a little bit. So first thing, before we get into the study, is just in general, how does BFR training improve bone density? Like, what is even happening that we can even make this hypothesis that BFR improves bone density? Well, some of this stuff's going to be familiar to you guys. We've been talking about it a lot because it's similar to the way we build our muscle. Some of this is. So one, BFR is known to increase metabolic stress. So because we wear the cuffs on our arms and legs and it's slowing down venous blood flow and it's creating hypoxia, we're getting an increase in metabolic stress. So we're creating an environment in the muscle that leads to the accumulation of metabolic byproducts like lactate. We've talked about lactate a lot before. And having that accumulation of metabolic byproducts stimulates the release of growth hormone, human growth hormone, and other factors that promote bone growth. So we kind of already know that's true because that's exactly why we're getting such a good increase in strength and muscle. The same process of creating metabolic stress and growth hormone. Growth hormone is good for bone, just like muscle. Kind of already know that that is true. Um, Also, we get more of a hormonal response. It's a little bit repetitive to what I just said, but there's more than just human growth hormone. So you get a bigger increase of human growth hormone, but also insulin-like growth factor, IGF-1. But that's a fancy, physiological term, but that's another well-known factor that builds muscle and builds bone. And so we know those increase with blood flow restriction training. Also, there's a bunch of studies that show that BFR training increased bone formation markers. So basically, the way bone grows is there's formation markers in the blood that represent how quickly you're getting cellular turnover of bone. All of the cells in our body turn over, right? We're not they die and regenerate, and there's this turning over of cells. As we age, that turnover slows down, right? But with blood flow restriction training, it's been shown that bone formation markers like BALP, and there's these other big words, but just so you know, these all are bone formation markers, and they're shown to increase with blood flow restriction training. So that's good. That's showing that you're making the markers that is going to turn over the cellular turnover in your bone more or faster, and that's great. There's also bone resorption marker. Resorption is not a good thing. Resorption is the breakdown of bone, and that's obviously happening. That happens too, but the more that's happening, the more your bone is going to degrade over time, like osteoporosis. So BFR reduces the expression of resorption markers. So meaning the markers that break down bone, when you use BFR, you're getting less of those. So that's a good thing. That's great. So you increase bone formation, you decrease bone resorption, and that results in better bone density. Um, and lastly, there's a formation of new blood vessels in the body that comes in the bones that comes from BFR training. It's known through research that BFR training leads to an increase in VEGF. Um, oh God, what does that stand for? Something endothelial growth factor. I can't remember what the V is, but anyway, it's something that is needed to increase blood vessels, and these tiny blood vessels are formulated all through the body. Brain, that's another reason why we get better cerebral flow, but also these blood vessels get created in the bones. And interestingly, we'll get into this when we get into the study. It showed that BFR training has a more significant increase in VEGF than high load or low load training does. So that's kind of big. Um, that's why blood flow throughout our whole body is increased so much with BFR training. And these tiny blood vessels within your bones transport osteoblasts and osteoclasts that are critical for bone remodeling. So you're able to get more of these osteoblasts into the bone because you're creating more blood vessels. So all of that information is kind of proven out in science and is known. But what we're really going to talk about today, oh, well, let me summarize really quick and then I'll go to the next. So basically, by increasing BFR training increases bone density by stimulating bone formation, reducing bone resorption, and then forming new blood vessels. All of this happens through the mechanics related to increased metabolic stress and hormonal responses, and that's how we increase bone density. So that summary is not in question. We that's been shown and that's been proven. What is in question, and this is the study that I looked at in case any of you want to look at the study yourselves, because I am just bringing snippets of the study of things I thought were interesting, but it's obviously a longer article if you want to look at it. But effects of blood flow restricted training on bone metabolism, and this is a systematic review and meta-analysis. So they didn't actually do any study. They looked at all the studies that were out there that's already been done on blood flow restriction training having to do with bone density or bone metabolism. And there was like 285 studies they found, but only 12 of them made it into this analysis because they had to meet certain criteria. So they looked at 12 studies that had been done. It ended up being like 379 participants or something like that across the 12 studies. And they kind of looked at what they found in from these studies. So I'm just going to kind of give some summaries and some interesting points from the study. So first of all, it's very clear. There's no doubt, really. It's very clear in the research that BFR with low load, that's how we use BFR, gives significantly more bone benefits than low load training without BFR. So load training just means you're not going super heavy. You're lifting weights. You know, it's probably something that's done a lot in fitness classes, Orange Theory, things you're doing on the bike, like Peloton. Like it's just kind of light to moderate weights without BFR. If you add BFR, you're going to get many more bone benefits, and that's super clear. There's no question about that. So, a couple examples here. Let's see. The IL means low intensity. So low intensity BFR training had greater increment of BALP. So that was one of the bone markers that I referenced earlier on, than just low intensity training in young men and in elderly women. So that's That's great because a lot of the studies are just on men, so it's hard to know exactly how that, and not even just men, but oftentimes college age men. So it's nice that they did this on elderly men, women, and so you can see it's like almost an 8%, I mean, 8 times more increase in BALP when they used BFR. So 7.8% increase versus just a 1% increase. So that's pretty significant. There's another one that said low intensity blood flow training had a significantly greater increment in bone mineral density. Bone mineral density is actually um, that's actually the measurement of your bone density. So that's like what you'll find on a DEXA scan. So everything we've talked about up to now are the markers in your blood that stimulates bone turnover. But what really measures bone density is BMD, bone mineral density. So in this study, it showed again among elderly women that there was about a 4 times increase, 3 to 4 time increase. I guess that's more like 3 time in bone mineral density in elderly women. So their bone mineral density was 3 times better. So that's pretty significant again. And then another thing that's cool is even just walking with BFR um, achieves similar effects on metabolism as some of these other ones. So basically, walking with BFR definitely helps bone density more than walking without BFR. So adding BFR to a light activity is going to give you better results. That is not really in question, but it's cool to see the study and kind of the research showing that. Um, so so these advantages of blood flow restriction training over just low intensity training is super important for older adults, adults undergoing musculoskeletal rehabilitation, and others who are not capable of or maybe aren't interested in withstanding high mechanical load. So, I mean, I'm a good example of that. I'm quote unquote healthy, strong, but I have an issue with my hip. I can't load it as well. I'm really not interested in loading it all the time because I know it compromises other things. So even though when they say in some of these tests, like older results or elderly, it's like you conjure up, frailty, but this actually applies to me to a lot more people than what they make it sound like. As anyone with a compromised joint, arthritis, something that a heavy load doesn't feel good on, bl- uh, blood flow restriction training is a great option over low intensity training only. Okay. What I really am curious about, and this is what I want to talk about most, is what about blood flow restricted training versus high load training? Okay, so how do we know, which one is better, or how do we use them together, or which one do we use, or how do we know what to do? So I would say in general, looking across all the studies, high load training tends to outperform low load training with BFR in terms of increasing bone formation markers. So it still looks like high load training is better than BFR, except there's a caveat here, and this is the thing I'm most interested in. There is no definitive consensus on which training method is more beneficial for the improvement of bone health because there's some studies that do show the opposite. So here's a couple of examples. This one study in 2021 showed that low intensity blood flow restriction training and high intensity trainer had very similar effect on the BLP of females, inactive females. So that study shows it was the same or very similar. So that's encouraging. Um, Another study showed, 3 studies actually found that BFR training had a more significant increase in IGF-1, growth hormone, and testosterone. So we've talked about this before in terms of muscle growth, that BFR training gives equal to or even more response in our hormones that build strength than even high load training. And these are also great for bones. Um, so these 3 studies showed that BFR training gave you a bigger increase in those than high load training. So again, although a lot of studies show the opposite, there are studies that show that BFR training has a bigger increase. And then here's another study that looked at more the VEGF, the vascular benefits. So BFR may affect osteoclast activity. So that's in the bone, getting those osteoclasts in there. And that comes from the hypoxia that you get with BFR and the reduction in pH. It activates factors for new vascularization, which is the VEGF. And this study showed that BFR training had a more significant increase in VEGF And that makes sense because even if you're doing high intensity training, it's not putting the stress on our vascular system to quite the extent that BFR training does because of this artificial stress we're putting on the outside of our veins with compression. It makes sense that we're getting an even bigger response in our vascular health and VEGF and creating more blood vessels because our body's going, we need more blood flow. And so it was shown in this study that BFR training gave a more significant increase in VEGF than not only low intensity training, but also high intensity training. And these blood vessels transport osteoblasts and osteoclasts. They're critical for bone remodeling. So this shows that maybe BFR has the upper hand in producing VEGF. And in my mind, I often think of these studies. Studies are so, in a box kind of, right? And we live in the real world. But I sometimes look at what these studies say, and then I think about how I feel with BFR. And I've done a lot of training. Like, yeah, it doesn't surprise me that there's a more increase in this because there's such a bigger stress on the vascular system. So the thing that I think in all these studies, the limitation that the limitation to these studies, I really believe, are the exercise protocols. There's so many, even in the 12 studies they picked, every study was different in their exercise protocol. Um, the thing that makes it limiting is high intensity training has been around forever, and it's pretty well established what protocol is best for high intensity training. It's like greater than 70%, like 70 to 80% of your one rep max is considered the gold standard for high intensity training, and that's what they do in all their protocols. But blood flow restriction training, they're still learning what the proper protocols are. So in some of these studies, they do lighter pressure on the cuffs or more pressure on the cuffs or only one muscle group for the study and they don't look at doing multiple muscle groups or they don't go to failure or so there's all these different protocols that of course are going to impact the results because you've done blood flow training enough to know if your cuffs are light, you don't get the same response. If you don't go to failure, you don't get the same response. If you just work one muscle group, you don't get the same overall fatigue as if you're working many muscle groups. So I do think that that is the biggest area of opportunity for these studies in general is to figure out these exercise protocols that are going to maximize the results in BFR because it's showing, even though across all studies, more of the time, high intensity training beats blood flow restriction training on bone development. Because there are some studies that show BFR equal or greater, that makes me think the high intensity studies aren't protocols aren't changing. So if the BFR, some are better and some are worse, that's because it's inconsistent. So if we know there are times that BFR can match high intensity, then we just need to be more consistent at doing the exercise protocols that are getting that maximum stimulation from blood flow restriction training. Um, the other inconsistency in the protocols is the cuff pressure and type. So there's different types of cuffs on the market. Some are wider, some are stiffer. The ones we have the individual pockets, which I love because you cannot go too tight on those. You will not stop blood flow. So it makes them the safest, and you can go tighter with more pressure safely. But there's so as an example of a study that they did blood flow restriction training with 110 millimeters of pressure and it did not give any increase in the osteocytic response. So that means that in that study, that doesn't mean blood flow restriction training doesn't work. It just means they didn't put enough pressure in. So again, being clear on what are the protocols we need to use with BFR to make sure we're getting the best result. And then the last thing is this, and this is kind of interesting. We mostly talked about the bone markers today, and I told you that bone mineral density, BMD, is kind of the gold standard of measuring bone density, but it takes 6 months for our bones to reformulate fully. So if a study's shorter than 6 months, it's not really going to be able to show changes in bone mineral density. And that's really the gold standard of is your bone density better or isn't it better? BMD will show you that. And most BFR studies are like 4 to 12 weeks. None of them are 6 months. So in most of the research, they saw no difference or very little difference in bone mineral density because none of the tests were long enough. So future studies need to focus on like 6 month plus interventions, which is, gosh, what I would love to do in our group. But in order to do this, people need to go get DEXA scans, which I'm trying to encourage people to do now because I think it's so important. But so my conclusions, and then we'll jump in. This is perfect, about 20 minutes, and we'll jump into conversation and questions. My conclusion, and I've kind of said this, I think mostly all along, if you are someone who's able to lift heavy safely and you enjoy it and you have good form, do a mix of both. Do BFR and do heavy lifting. I think you're going to get some different benefits from both. You're kind of getting a little bit best of both worlds, and it's kind of an insurance policy that you're doing all you can for your body. However, I do think we can still get better BFR outcomes for bone density than most of these studies showed us with the more robust exercise programs that we're actually doing. I looked at all these studies, and what we do in our workouts is typically more than what these protocols are. And it's just kind of common sense to me, and hopefully to you too. When you're working out with BFR hard and you feel that burn and you feel that fatigue and you do feel it in multiple muscle groups, you can tell the workouts that challenged you more from a burn standpoint. And that's directly related to the lactate, which is directly related to the human growth hormone, which is directly related to getting those bone markers. So I just think a lot of it is getting that robust exercise protocol with BFR. And then, I think it's pretty clear that it's not if BFR works, it's clear that it works. Like I said, for sure for the low intensity training. It's just how do we best optimize it for bone and other benefits? And that's something that I'm passionate about and trying to work on in our program, but it's hard. Science always lags behind real life. So I'm curious as science continues to develop, and there's tons of interest in this area in science. There are more and more studies on it. So hopefully they'll get better and better at the protocols and the BFR exercises to really see how much more benefit can we get from BFR than we know.